Traceability. I think the title is pretty obvious. If you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going to get there. And we've seen that on a number of occasions. So this is typically something that we encounter when we get in contact with a new customer of ours or colleagues or whatever, talking about their processes. And you typically always have a process in place. It's normally certified, everything's hunky-dory, and it's detailing what development steps you need to take, you and your team. But it's kind of tricky to give detailed directions to a large team. And also members of a team kind of understand different things when you tell them something, right? And something that we're seeing a lot is that these processes aren't really built in the way that you're telling them where they're gonna end up. It's just gonna be about stepwise instructions. Start here, go there, do that. But we end up, that's usually a big question. Are you gonna end up in the expected place or at the expected target? And would a different team also interpret it in the same way? So a solution, if we just try to put it in a naive way, would be to come up with unambiguous definitions of the expected end result. And what is unambiguous? We'll have a look at that a bit and see what kind of difficulties we can see in process definitions today. And we also need a clear map of all possible ways of getting there, because building a medical device is a team effort, and there's not going to be one simple way of getting there. And every team will also come up with their own ways of reaching this target. So you probably have seen something like this within your company or other companies you work for, whatever. Some kind of a description over a development process. This is what the R&D typically give their members and say, this is how we work within our company. Or maybe you've seen it in this depiction, also possible. I have to be really honest with you. I see a lot of these things, but I'm always a bit insecure what they're supposed to mean. What are you allowed to do? And where are you supposed to start? And what happens next? And when are you allowed to correct your mistakes that you did earlier on? This is also a similar thing. Here, it kind of looks like you have to start up on the left, define intended use, and then you just go straight ahead. And in a couple of years, you will finish with system validation. Is this the way you work within a company? Is this the way we allow our team members to also learn when they do something? Are we allowed to go back in this thing? I don't know. To me, it's not really clear in a way. And sometimes these descriptions aren't always that helpful. And I'm pretty sure that most of you have seen something similar like this as well. So this is a common graphical representation of the familiar QSR. So we have our user needs, we have design inputs, we have design process, we have design outputs. We're going to end up with a medical device. We're going to do some verification. We're going to do some validation. There's going to be a bit of reviewing involved, right? I started in the introduction with talking about the traceability, and I think this is a really core concept here as well, because traceability has one major purpose, and that is to provide an evidence of completeness. We've done everything we should. Bits and pieces are connected, and it sticks. You know, it's good. It's solid. This is like our architecture of how we provide our development documentation. And in this image, we have a lot of familiar terminology here, like user need, design input, and design process, and design output. And we have arrows, and we have kind of hints of traceability. But I'm guessing the review portion with the design process is not really about traceability. I'm just guessing here. And also, I'm not quite sure exactly what we're supposed to deliver. If I was in a development team here, I would probably guess we're going to do some user needs. And then we're going to deliver some design process. No, I don't think so, really. You know, okay, I'm going to stop myself here, and we're going to take it step by step, maybe. So one common confusion is we have these boxes, right, in our nice diagrams or flow charts, whatever we call them. And my first question will be, is this an action or is this a design item? And with design item, I'm going to try to keep the terminology clear here. For me, a design item is some kind of a piece of data that we want to capture and that we want to put in relationship with other pieces of data. And here, coming out of the viewpoint from a guy working for a documentation tool vendor, we're going to talk about documentation as a data point here. So design item is a little piece of the documentation that could be, looking at the picture on the right, a user need, for example, or a design input, or maybe a verification test case or something like that. And now we see that some of these boxes, they contain something that we can consider design items, and some don't. And the first thing would be to separate those actions from design items. And one thing that's pretty certain is also that the action items, they will probably also generate some kind of data or design items. And there we have to go through the process of trying to figure out what kind of output do we get from a design, from an action. And looking at our little image in the beginning, I would just claim now that we have a couple of actions in there. One says design process. To me, that's more of an action than something that we should deliver. We should deliver a design, but the process of designing is gonna give us some kind of output. Review is definitely an action. Verification and validation, you can basically argue for both action and for design item, but I'm going to go for action at the moment. I'm going to see what comes out of it. And having found a few actions, we maybe get a bit more concrete by just taking over a couple of design items that we find in this workflow in the beginning, and there I'm going to go for user need, design input, and design output. That's data points that we will deliver. We will write user needs. We will write some kind of design input descriptions and design output descriptions as well. So now, what kind of design items can we derive from our actions that we came up with? So we had the design process, right? And that will resolve into some kind of design output. So in that image that we saw, that was just like a little process reference, do some design processing here. And the output would be something that they also kind of put in. Pretty common. Most people don't really even stop and think about it that much, but it can confuse people when actually go into the details. And we are trying to go into details of coming up with a really unambiguous kind of end result. This is what we want to see when we're finished, and that's what we're aiming for here, right? So from the verification validation process, I would say that we would come up with some kind of verification test cases, and hopefully also we would gather some verification test results, and the same would go for the validation, right? And in terms of taking the action of reviewing, we would probably also come up with some review protocols. I put that inside of parentheses now because I think it's objective evidence of following our process, but it's not going to be like the core documentation of our design as such. So I'm not really considering it to be a design item, but you know, we're going to keep the paper and we're gonna have it as part of a technical file, that's for sure. Now we're now coming up with user need, design input, design output, validation, and verification, test case and results, and some review protocol here. So these are our full set of design items. You can, of course, go into more detail and say that, okay, we have multiple types of design input. You maybe would like to describe the software portion of things, the hardware portion of things. If you have assay development, maybe you want to do that in different terms. That's totally fine and up to you. And if you're using this terminology within your company, go for it, definitely. And the same goes for design output, of course. If it's drawings, source code, whatever, formulas, calculations, whatever. But I'm going to stick with these generic terms now anyway for the design input and output. Now, so we've taken care of the boxes, right? And that's good. Now we have a similar problem here, right? So we have boxes and arrows in many of these charts. And for us, the question is going to be, does this arrow represent some kind of flow? So we're going to go from step 1 to step 2. Is that what the arrow actually means? Or does it mean some kind of a relationship? And I would say that a relationship is something that defines a dependency between design items, between our data points. So having a user need, breaking that down into a design input item will, of course, generate the dependency. The design input item is dependent on the incoming user need, right? And flow, on the other hand, is basically describing that we're going to do one thing before the other. So this is the way: start working here, do that afterwards. And the confusion is really coming from that we probably use arrows for both. Now, when it comes to flow, sometimes I'm not going to say that you're not supposed to use workflow, right? That's not the take-home portion of this presentation. It's about sometimes flows are not always that suitable for telling us how to work. If you're thinking about that, we have at least a medium-sized organization. Let's say we have a team of 5, 10, 20, 50 people working on designing a product. Now, I just Googled a bit and came up with this little chart on the right here. It's something very simple for keeping track of a bug. And it says, okay, we're going to start. The bug is open. We're going to review it. It's under investigation. We can move it to pending state. We can move it back into under investigation if we want to. Can cancel, complete, and at the end it can be closed. Okay, sounds decent enough. We're going to leave it like that. And I'm going to do a little rant about why I don't really like it, why I crossed it over. But bear with me, right? So workflows, they get very, very complex when you have a lot of different people involved and you have a lot of tasks and you have a lot of data points that you can work on. So is there a logical order? That's a good question, right? And if I would like to describe the exact logical order, it would get very, very complex. And I've said it's very easily inaccurate for manual tasks. The reason why I said manual tasks is basically because if you do automatic tasks, basically you try to set up an automatic system or a software or something like that to do it, you need to do this thorough definition of how things work. For manual, I don't think you necessarily need to. And I think it's sometimes also not a good work. You can think of workflows that that are kind of sometimes stopping you from doing what you actually really want to do. And an example here, if we look at the chart again from on the right, let's say we managed to get to canceled and then closed. And 3 minutes later, you got a good idea in saying that, no, this was a totally valid bug. In this description of the workflow, I'm not allowed to go back to open again. I'm not allowed to go back in this thing. And I've seen this through my career. It's happening all the time, and it's just annoying people. You go to the admin and tell them, can you please change the state from close to open again? Because, you know, I missed something. And then he says, yeah, no, maybe. Can can't you just open a new bug instead and copy everything from the last one? Okay, so you do that. And even with such a simple and obvious workflow, you end up in these kind of dead ends, and you get annoyed, and you realize that, okay, they're not really built for people, right? These kind of workflows. And maybe one note to take home here is that many of these defined flows, they have no formal importance. And if I take a couple of examples here, if I write a user need prior to validation test, formally speaking, who really cares? I would probably like to review my user need prior to running my validation test and also reviewing my validation test. But I could write the validation test today, write the user need tomorrow, hook them up on the day after tomorrow, and then go through the formal portions of it. And on the other hand, there are some formally required steps that we should take in a certain order. For example, we cannot really review a user need prior to writing it, of course. Simple enough. But a lot of these arrows, they kind of give you the idea that you're supposed to do a certain thing first before you can do the next thing. And I think that's in many ways a misconception. And if you do it within an organization, please don't tell anyone about it. That's usually the way things run. But I think you should actually be a bit more open about it and use it as a possibility instead. Let's say you have a test team being assigned early on in a project, which is a great thing. Let them do their thing. If they've done 3 similar devices for the last 10 years, they probably know what they're doing. If you're starting from scratch and don't really know what the product is going to be, then it's maybe too early to have these guys joining in. But it's about allowing people to do their work and about using your resources in a sensible way. Now, enough ranting about flows. Relationships, I like. Relationships defines a dependency. It makes the bookkeeping easy about saying this is related to that. I think it's very simple to understand that the direction of that dependency also defines an impact. So if I go to the image on the right-hand side here from a little trace description, we say that the intended user UN11 there is traced to or has dependency operable with gloves and smooth user interface. If I go and change the intended user, I should probably have a look at the underlying pieces of design inputs or design items, because changing the intended user, if I'm saying we're going to have children using this product, then I probably need a different assortment of gloves and so on. So very simple and very easy to follow and understand the impact. And it's also very effective when it comes to understanding how you should work, in which order you should work when updating your documentation or when refining your documentation. The impact or the direction of a relationship is often the most efficient flow. So you probably not go down at the bottom level, changing a test case, and then you work your way up. Of course you could, but at least you have the help then of the defined dependencies. But start with top level, follow the dependency, and see what kind of impact you have. And there are many ways to get to Rome, right? We know that. So just following a simple flowchart is not always the good way to go. But if we start and look at our nice QSR here, let's see if we can define some dependencies. So we see that we have our design items, user need, design input, design output, and we draw some arrows. And now these arrows are not flow. They are relationships or traces or whatever you may call them. So user need should be hooked up with the validation test case. A validation test case has, of course, a validation test result sooner or later, one or more. User need is detailed into design inputs, and design inputs are detailed into design outputs. And design outputs are tested. So this is kind of trying to extract what we had in the original image, if you still have it in your memory. And it looks a bit, I don't know, to me, it looks a bit more comforting. I know pretty much what I'm supposed to end up with. And now if we take the whole sequence of events as well into the picture of saying, what do we do when? I'm kind of free here in how I want to start working. I can write a verification test case. I know sooner or later it should be a test result. Oh, that's a typo, sorry. It should be a verification test result on the right-hand side, the second green box there. And I should come up with some design output. I could up with some design input. They should be traced to each other sooner or later. And also, if we take the notions of having, I don't know, waterfall models or iterative Scrum approaches, doesn't really matter. I can work on a couple of user needs, detail them in design out input, go back, work on more user needs, refine the ones I did last iteration. The impact will follow the traceability or the dependency, of course. So there is no absolutely no contradiction to different ways of working with the process if you know what the expected traceability target should look like. But we're not quite there yet. Okay. Now, having taken this little graphical overview of the QSR into bits and pieces, identifying actions, identifying design items and dependencies, it could be that we still may have some gaps now. And one of the major gaps that we see with our customers is terminology. They're calling the same thing a number of different things. They're calling, they're having same name for different different information, and it kind of just messes up how people talk about their documentation. And one thing we always recommend is to make sure that if there are some agreed upon terms used in your field, why not just reuse them? I know I came in contact with one company. They start with specification and break them down into requirements, basically the opposite of the rest of the business. Yeah, you get to learn it within a couple of weeks within the company, but still it's confusing for every new person coming in contact with that organization. I think they could have saved themselves a lot of time and explanation effort if they just changed that a number of years ago. Now, another way to look for gaps is that, have you found all the dependencies? That's very important. Is this all you need to track in terms of dependencies? And I think the foremost way is this how you normally work? Now, this may not necessarily be part of your process description, but it's like the convention and the wisdom that you have within the company that you should now actually get into some formal description. Is this how you normally work? Is this what you call things? Is this how you do things? Take it out and use it. It's going to help you and your organization, because if you do it one way and define it a different way, you're just creating confusion, and we're trying to do the opposite. Now, so I've been trying to fill the gaps here, seeing that we do not really talk about design input as the design items within our organization. I'm going to claim that we talk about design input requirements. And we also, of course, have verification test cases hooked up to design input requirements as well. And once again, sorry for the typo on the right here. So it's verification test case tracing to a verification test result in the same way that we have for validation test case and validation test results. And here we have now very simple but complete traceability. You see where the dependencies are. You see what you're supposed to come up with when you're finished. It will take probably months or years to get there. So we'll do a couple of user needs, a couple of design input requirements, start on testing, generating results, and sooner or later you will have a complete traceability and complete documentation of your product. And I've put review protocols down on the bottom right here. and you will probably do reviews of all sorts of design items and key protocols of that. But I'm not really considering that as part of the traceability in this picture. Now, so we started here. Something that to me looks pretty clear, to be honest, but still a bit confusing when you think about what do I have to do now and how are things supposed to be hooked up per traceability. And we ended up over here, and I think it's a bit clear where we're actually going for. And you can also think of this as if you have the tooling to support you in checking that every user need has a validation test case, at least one. And every user need has been implemented by the design input requirement and so forth for the design outputs. It makes your life a lot easier, right? Maybe something that you can take home and try out on your own processes. It's not really that tricky. I had the opportunity of doing yesterday with the company. Turned out that they weren't sure. They need to go back, talk about, we do call it this or we call it that. It makes a difference. Once and for all, try to put it on a piece of paper, make it consistent. Pick an internal process. Try to identify actions. Actions are not deliverables. Actions will probably produce deliverables. That means being design items or something documented, data points coming out, right? And identify the data coming out of the actions and try to see what dependencies you will have between all the data points or design items in your development process. And looking for and filling gaps is an important portion of it. Do not forget the legacy of how you've been working so far. This is always something that kind of stabilizes how a team actually can work together. So this is a very important portion of it, creating conventions. And if you can put these conventions to paper, then it makes it a lot more stable in how your outcome should look like, and people know where they're going towards, and they will also understand what bits and pieces they have to do to get there. And of course, you can repeat the same thing for neighboring processes and see how data from one process is being relayed or be dependent with on data from other processes. And I think this is a good way of working. And you can also then see how one process triggers another process by passing information. So there you have your kind of flow again. But looking at the flowchart that's also something I just snatched off the net, right? I don't know who's supposed to follow that one. I just feel a bit sorry for them. But maybe we can make life a bit easier for them if they want to, right? Okay. We cannot do this. This is our core thing. This is just an example from our application, Aligned Elements, where we try to come up with some kind of a traceability structure. It may look in very many different ways depending on what your development process look like. It's perfectly fine. But I think it's important to show in the beginning to any project team where they're supposed to end up when they're finished with their development. And finished is something that maybe we do not always reach. We will have some open issues and things like that, but it's of course good to know what they are, and then we go through all the other disciplines of deciding if our product is good enough for the market or not. Right, that's basically all I wanted to talk about in terms of coming up with traceability. I don't know if you could if you got a bit of a bad conscience and realize that, oh, maybe we should do this as well. If so, don't hesitate. If not, congratulate. Thanks a lot.